Good afternoon, good morning. Mark Johnson from Loyalty 360. Hope everyone's happy, safe, and well. I want to welcome you back to another edition of Loyalty Live. In this series, we talk to the leaders in customer channel and brand loyalty about the technology, trends, and best practices that are impacting a brand's ability to drive unique experiences, engagement, but most importantly, customer loyalty. Through the month of April and this first week of May, we have a special mini-series on Loyalty Live, looking at the trends in customer loyalty and customer experience that will likely shape the months ahead. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Emil Sarkissian. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Loyalty Methods, one of the up-and-coming, they've been around for a while, but one of the up-and-coming customer loyalty platforms, doing some great work there. So, Emil, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. For those who don't know you, we always like to start off with a little bit of personal information, get to know our guests a little bit better. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your role with Loyalty Methods?
Sure. Yeah. So my, I started out as being mostly an IT guy, working a lot in the banking industry and kind of evolving from there and kind of getting into CRM, understanding a little bit more about the concepts behind marketing and personalization. So eventually, about maybe 14, 15 years ago, I got, into loyalty and kind of understood the significance of it. At that time, it was mostly airlines, but that's how Loyalty Methods came to be. We incorporated it back in 2007. And so I have been since the CEO of Loyalty Methods. So my role in the company has always been to provide thought leadership, ideation on projects to really get to that next level of how do we make an interesting story in the market beyond, trivial, transactional loyalty and kind of get beyond that. And so over the years, as technology has evolved, I mean, when I started, there weren't any iPhones or anything. So things have changed so dramatically. And this space continues to be of great interest to me and to my colleagues that is still with me after all this time in the company. So that's who we are, and that's what we're about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Over the last year, it's been very challenging for brands, for marketers, for technology entities like yourself, and challenging in a lot of opportunities as well. Consumers have evolved a good bit over the last year. What did you see, or what have you seen as to how customers are evolving, changing, and how can brands and marketers kind of adapt to that?
Yeah, it has been a very interesting year, and as many people have known, obviously. So as far as consumer evolution, it's almost like to me, essentially, when we started at the beginning of the pandemic, I think digital commerce and in general the whole delivery, economy and all the different aspects of, just living in a digital shopping space and digital service procurement and delivery space of any kind was sort of a fraction of what was going on in traditional retail and traditional services. But I think what happened with consumers is that, and they started learning that language of, I remember when I was afraid to even plug in my credit card, into a website, thinking that somebody is going to, immediately go and withdraw money. And, and then it evolved from there. People got very comfortable, but they still were not entirely, not everyone, and not the large population was still not, out there doing that, especially older audiences and people who are not, accustomed to this and they didn't grow up with the internet, not the digital natives, right? People who are behind them in terms of the technology stack. So I think for them, it was sort of like they were dabbling in this new language of trade and services. And suddenly the pandemic essentially thrust them into sort of a country that only speaks that language, really, because that's the only thing that made sense. And so it almost feels like they had to overnight, take their little sort of whatever experience they had. Some people had a lot of experience, some people had less experience. I think Amazon helped prepare people a lot, actually, with their frictionless world of trade, but of e-commerce. But I think that's just essentially the consumers had to evolve because they were essentially pressured into, okay, now everything has changed dramatically and overnight. And that was a a learning curve for everybody. And I think that's the evolution that I've seen, is that people have sort of changed now. And I don't think we can go, people talk about going back to normal. I don't know that this is really ever, that perception is never going to go back to what it was before. I think this has done a huge leap in terms of people's thinking of the digital economy and in e-commerce in general. So that's the evolution I saw there, as the sudden transition into digital space a lot more,
Okay.
and people's adoption of it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Been a very wild ride, especially for some of the brands and marketers that had to adapt to that, right? So they had new technology, they had buying online, pick up in store, all the security parameters.
That's right. Yeah.
Being able to do contactless payment. So definitely kind of a unique and challenging but opportune time over the last year.
Yeah, and a lot of them partnered with delivery services quickly because they couldn't launch their own. Like, you couldn't just overnight create a massive delivery infrastructure. So that's kind of where I think a lot of interesting partnerships got forged, as well as that part of that adaptation process. I was talking about consumers, but marketers also had to learn very quickly how to change and marketers and generally business people had to learn how to change and how to partner with the right channels to get to customers, because customers were suddenly no longer coming to the normal outlets and channels, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. And the first part of this year, we did some research, asked a number of our supplier partners, some of the agencies, what were the top trends they were looking at for 2021. And it came up, we came back with a kind of a top three. Data integration was the first one. Personalization was the second one. And then the third one was agility. So obviously very relevant, very germane. What are you seeing in regard to data integration? It's a big topic. Brands know they have tons of data. They know they have to create simplicity. They know they have to action on it. How do brands need to be thinking about ways that looking at data to, exceed the customer expectations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are really a couple of aspects of it that at least from my perspective, and this is, by the way, not new. We've seen this through the years. I think data integration in general, and so that the use of data. So there's the collection and there's the mechanics of making sure that data flows cleanly in the system. And so that's like the blood flow of the system. But then you also have the use of the data, which is really the analysis, the modeling, applying AI models, any kind of predictive analytics on it, which is really the use, the brain of it, right? So we've seen companies struggle with both sides of this equation. I think that a surprising amount of businesses out there that did not start out as digital first, right? There's a lot of companies that just, they've been around for much longer than some of these new trends. And even though they're not that new anymore, the internet's been around for long enough. But the reality is that their ability to orchestrate that low-level flow of just collecting, cleansing, managing, purging, securing as well, a big deal now, the data, and getting it into their business in a way that actually flows without interruptions and without a lot of friction, and without having to have people do manual work and fully automate it and all that stuff. That is surprisingly, my view is that there's just a lot of, as I said, non-digital first businesses that are still struggling with that at the enterprise level, because it's just not that, it seems like an easy thing, and then you start to try to do it across all channels consistently, cleanly, not that easy. And so I think a lot of the challenges are there. And then for the companies who are overcoming those challenges, it then becomes possible to make good use of that data through the modeling and through the analysis and so on, and observation. And then the next challenge after that becomes, how do you speed that up? That whole, because I always view, I like to, as you know, I like to do a lot of analogies, but to me, loyalty has always been about a conversation. You have an ongoing conversation, you keep somebody's attention, and they come back for more because they're interested in that conversation, because it's relevant to them. So, and it's beneficial in some way. And so I think what's interesting with the data is that having the ability to move that data smoothly and to get it up and down the stack. So basically you take it from the channels and you move it all the way up to the analytical tools and all the way back. The faster you do that, the more this conversation seems like it's an engaging, interesting conversation. I mean, if somebody had to think 5 minutes every time you ask them a question in a conversation, you wouldn't have much of a conversation, right? So that's why, but you see a lot of that in businesses actually happens all the time, where you got like batch stuff. I have people that tell me, can we get our data in real time? And I say, yeah, sure. And I'm thinking seconds. They're thinking like less than 3 days and something like that, So I'm like, okay, it's very, people's idea of what is fast actually is really based into their capability to orchestrate that process in their own company, in their own infrastructure. And I think that is a surprising thing for me, even to this day. I still see it, and it's, so that's when you talk about data integration, my thinking is that it's the comprehensive, clean strategy of getting data in, and also all the way up and down, and then speeding up the whole process so that the conversation can actually keep going a lot smoother, and you keep people's attention. Otherwise, it just dies, right? So yeah, so that's where, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, you spoke about that a little bit. How can brands optimize that data collection and create some simplicity there that enable better real-time relevant interactions with consumers across channels?
Well, there's a few things that you can do. When you say optimize, there's really a couple of ways that I can think about it, right? So, and actually complementary to each other. First of all, is you have to really think about what data makes sense to collect and what data is really not that relevant, right? And I think it's, and then they also have to think about what data is really no longer acceptable to collect, from all the GDPR and the CCPA and all the different types of regulations that are out there now. And now there's an assault on cookies and things like that used to be a lot more pervasive, and now it's like different. So optimization to me is about essentially getting data payloads to make sense from a size perspective and from a content perspective and from a regulatory perspective. So that is really the key things that need to be considered in any data collection strategy. And then the other thing is to maybe sort of focus on real-time or near real-time data collection methods and upgrade your technologies that, so that you don't have these batch files flying around that take days and days to get into your systems, right? So I think those are from a technological standpoint, purely, what a strategy would look like would be to move the enterprise, and a lot of digital transformation efforts actually focus on exactly those types of technology, and they move it into the cloud. They want to scale it up, so it works faster and so on. So anyway, so that's kind of the when you say the optimization process, I think, as I said, it's the relevant data, it's the size of the payload, and it's getting it to move faster, basically across the different channels.
And one other quick question in this area: the zero-party data, declared data, more and more important. You talked about the attack on the cookies. You have GDPR and have the Virginia privacy laws here in the U.S. and GDPR in Europe, CCPA and CDPA here. Zero-party data, declared data is a way to get a unique data set, preferences, interests, or from customers. How can brands use that to differentiate themselves from their competitors?
Well, I think, yeah, in the context of conversation, again, I always look at it as a conversation, but the conversation of zero-party data, as you said, is what people tell you directly to your face. They say, this is who I am, this is what I want, this is how I like to be treated. That's usually what those preferences and things actually trying to do, or making a request for an order and so on. So those, that data is obviously voluntarily given by consumers. And so it has more power because they're really trying to get a message across. It's not something that you're deducing. So zero-party data in a conversation, to me, is what people directly say to you. The first-party data, which is a little bit more more indirect, is essentially like reading your digital body language. You're trying to understand what people are doing by just looking at what they're doing. You're trying to get sort of get insight into their intent from the data that they're generating by just interacting with your business in different ways. So I think zero-party data has more power to actually allow brands to compete because it more directly specifies what people want and what they think they want. Now there's a little bit of a caveat here, is that as Ford once said, if people ask me, if I ask people what they want, they would say a faster horse, not a car, because they can't quite imagine that, right? So I think zero-party data has power within certain contexts. But it also, I think it should be complemented by first-party data, and in some cases third-party data. But the first-party data to really try to match their behavior to what they're saying. So what people say is not always what they end up doing, right? So I think there's a little bit of a mismatch there. So the real power of zero-party data, I think, is that you have that extra angle to look at what people think they want versus how they, behave, when interacting with your business. So it gives that extra viewpoint, and it's a great thing. Obviously, because it's as I said, it's intentional. It's a direct communication. So obviously, it will lead to better results if you respond to that, in addition to just getting first-party data, which is tracking them around your website and so on.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
The second topic theme that we saw that was impactful was the idea of personalization. There's this new hyper personalization idea. Can you talk to us about what hyper personalization means to you and to your team?
Right. It's interesting. So it goes back to the same thing I kind of said at the beginning, which was, I think that it's not necessarily, but part of it is basically the speed, right? The real timeness of things, right? Because essentially, there was a time when we started, and some years into it, when personalization meant, okay, I'm just going to go in my database, probably weeks or even months after the fact, and look at everything you've done and do all this modeling and batch work to make sure that I can present some offers to you that you're likely to respond to, right? And that was like a very, very drawn out process that used to take time. You ran scoring models. Technology was not up to date. Cloud was not even a thing, so people couldn't really do this quickly. So essentially, personalization in those days meant, way after the fact, deriving some meaning into what people did and try to apply that meaning later. And by that time, as they say, the moment of truth for people is usually in the moment. They're not, if it's kind of like that Seinfeld where George thinks of a joke that he would respond to, like 6 days later or something. You can't do that because the context is lost, right? So hyper personalization, in my view, is something where you actually are able to, in real time, as people navigate around your site, as they're doing things, to start to make those deductions about, again, because they're basically generating first data in real time. So if you can analyze and crunch that first data in that same moment, and then basically text them, or like a lot of times I'll be browsing around a website and you'd see a little chat window come up and say, it looks like you're doing this. Would you like to talk about that with the agent or whatever? So those kinds of moment of truth, like really close to the time when you're actually thinking of something, are far more powerful and far more impactful, and the likelihood of conversion is much higher. So I think that's how I see about hyper personalization is that to the second kind of, watching people, in a way that's hopefully not intrusive, right? But in a way that actually generates opportunities to capture their context of thinking and then respond to that quicker, than what you would normally do. So that's hyper personalization from that angle. There's also another thing I see a lot is that a lot of people overuse personalization. So hyper personalization, in my view, can also be bad if you do it the wrong way, where you're basically bugging them all the time and you're creating a lot of push notifications and just constant pop-ups, and that's kind of like the other side of it, where you got to be careful not to get into that. But actually, there's a lot of value in capturing that hot moment when they're thinking about something, they're really into it, they're focused right now. That's the moment to really respond to what they're doing. And that's where hyperpolarization, I think, has a competitive advantage, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you look at hyper-personalization, I think you mentioned you don't want to bug them, right? You want to make sure that you're getting it right, make sure that it's engaging. But there's also a cost with hyper-personalization as well. Doing it at scale, doing it right, using that zero-party data we talked about earlier. What's the best way to track and measure the kind of the correlation between personalization, hyper-personalization, and increased customer engagement and purchasing?
I think so the traditional methods actually still work very well. I mean, I don't think that so basically it's just that it's the same about measure. Same thing happens with measurement as is true about responding to real-time intent. So you have to, so in order to respond to real-time intent, you have to sort of have a real-time measurement. Okay, and so if you think about it, people like Facebook, for example, pioneered that way, years ago, when they were sort of doing different experiments on different parts of their audience and constantly comparing in real time what's really happening and who's responding better, right? And so I think doing A/B testing, but accelerating it and sort of putting it on steroids, in the real-time world, is really one way that we think is a good way to establish what works and what doesn't, in certain contexts, in certain environments, with certain types of audiences, segmented in different ways. So really, it comes back to taking the techniques that work in general, like the A/B testing and stats about that, and control groups and so on, and then applying those in much more faster real-time ways in order to be able to respond meaningfully, right, to these interactions, and to tune things a little bit in real time.
Yeah, that'd be great. We actually had a question from someone watching live. Is it possible to crunch the data in real time and get an accurate result with regard to hyper-personalization?
It's heavily dependent on the context, but I will say that these days, with technologies that sort of, that has been the holy grail of a lot of the cloud-based technologies and cloud-native technologies. You have things like, in the old days when Yahoo started using things like Hadoop, which was like this framework for batch processing that would crunch what they used to call big data. In those days, it's not as big of a term now, but that was a big thing. Oh, big data, you can get terabytes and petabytes of data and move it through this huge batch system, but it used to be a batch system still. Today, we have things like Spark, which is a product from a company called Databricks, which kind of does the same thing Hadoop did, but in real time. So the answer is yes, it's very much possible to actually do that in a very short amount of time. Obviously, there are considerations in terms of practical limits to things, but honestly, I think that a lot of this is now possible with the technologies and with the cloud scale that people like AWS and Azure and all these cloud vendors provide now. That is pretty much unlimited, and you can vary it up and down. Let's say if you had a campaign and you wanted to do a lot of number crunching really fast, you can scale up your Spark cluster to something that's potentially hundreds or even thousands of nodes, and then come back down when you're done. So that kind of, and then not get charged for the whole the hundreds of nodes over time. Just do it quickly. So so those kinds of things I think are changing the dynamics and also the cost equation of being able to do these sort of real-time experiments with what works and what doesn't, basically. And I think that's a big thing. Yeah,
absolutely. And the last area we had was agility, looking at over the last year, brands had to be agile. They had to develop buying online, picking from store, right? They had new payment methods they had to roll out to truly address the concerns and consternations that existed during COVID. When you look at agility, one of the biggest challenges we see is getting the technology stack right. So as customers change, as the interests in products and services may change, getting that right technology mix is very important in brands being able to be agile. What are some kind of best practices you have with organizations to get the technology right? Using enterprise platforms or using very robust platforms like yourself? How should brands look to get that right?
Yes, it's a very, very good question. So in terms of, first of all, I think that your spotlight on agility is right on, because a lot of times what we see is that just getting a single tool like our platform, RCX, or even like something like Salesforce Marketing Cloud or Responses, any of those tools that are out there in the marketing technology stack, just getting one tool or a couple of tools out there and thinking that, okay, this is really going to change the equation is not always the case. And a lot of times people get a little disappointed. And I think the reality, and this is something that we always start out when we try to implement our platform, we come with a map, like a technology stack map that we see that starts at the channels and sort of goes through the transactional systems into the data management systems like cleansing and making sure everything's fine, then going all the way up to data warehousing and sort of big data systems and that kind of stuff, and then coming back down. So if you look at this enterprise we call it the enterprise footprint, the CX machine that you have. It has many components, and each one of them is a different part of the marketing technology stack. And so one of the big things that I think is important when you adopt any new platform, whether it's a loyalty platform or marketing cloud platform or some other thing in between, like a referral platform, there's lots of different pieces of the marketing stack now that you can buy separately. The big thing about any of these things is to have this big picture in your head of how the conversation flows from the consumers, which are at your channels, essentially at the bottom, and how the conversation escalates all the way up to your analytical systems that are at the top, whether they're real time, near real time, or even batch, and then how that conversation flows back through all the systems that are in the stack. So I think having that comprehensive framework in mind,
Right.
and again, we offer such a model every time we go in, because we want to also understand when you walk into an enterprise, a lot of times they already have a lot of the pieces, so you just want to arrange them in a nice model that kind of gives you that ability to orchestrate the conversation in a meaningful way. So as I said, marketing tools are immensely powerful these days, and it's really great what we have in the ecosystem. It's just that it could get very confusing, especially in large enterprises, with lots of teams and lots of politics in between and lots of things that are happening, that eventually these platforms becomes less effective if there's no guiding strategy of how the entire stack would work together to deliver this conversation. That people lose focus that actually I'm trying to make a good conversation, a relevant dialogue with my customers, and they start to obsess over platforms and draw boundaries around them and all kinds of things. So that's where I think I would say that is the number one priority that I set for any project we get into, is to make sure that picture is very clear before we start focusing on individual boxes in that model. So
Okay, great. In the last technology we have, I guess it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I always find myself cracking up at some of the way you phrase things. Your
sorry.
George from Seinfeld analogies,
Yeah.
and faster horse analogies.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, we're irrational, and so it's always great to hear. What's one other trend that brands should be cognizant about as we recover from this pandemic that would help them enhance their customer loyalty, customer experience efforts?
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting question. I think, and I've been looking at this really carefully, because it's absolutely fascinating what this pandemic. I mean, other than the fact it's been tragic in so many ways, and we're suffering still tremendously worldwide. I think that it's very interesting from an economic standpoint what's really happened, and so it's essentially whipsawing the demand, curve up and down basically, and what's happening right now. What I'd like to think is post-pandemic. It's not in the whole world. Clearly, we can see that today. But what's going to happen? I think currently, what's coming to us, and I think everybody. I'm not the primary thinker in this area, but a lot of economists have said that we're seeing an unprecedented surge in demand. And so what this means is that we're going, because there's a lot of money out there, first of all, and then there is a lot of pent-up demand because people have been locked down for a long time worldwide. So no travel, nothing happened, right? So now people are really, really interested in going out and spending and doing things, right? And so I think what marketers can do here is that there'll be no shortage of short-term. There'll be basically a demand will outstrip supply in a lot of areas, and we're already seeing pricing increases and all that stuff. But I think what's interesting is marketers can take advantage, because you will see people at your door that would normally not so easily just be there, because just based on the dynamics of the entire aggregate sort of economic situation that we're in. And so I think that's a great opportunity to make a good first impression, and to sort of to capture some of that traffic in the long run and sort of make them loyal customers. And I think that's an amazing opportunity, because, as I said, that will be a temporary. I'm very much thinking that this will be a temporary situation. We obviously eventually the supply chain will adjust. All the bottlenecks will get worked out, and people will start to, prices will come down in some areas potentially. I hope. So it'll go back to more of the current of the previous cycle before the pandemic, where getting new customers, retaining new customers will actually be more difficult. And so I think that reduced cost of new people showing up at your doorstep, just by virtue of the global situation, is probably something that marketers can take advantage of. That's what I think is an interesting opportunity.
Well, I think that's very unique as well. I think that, to your point, that things seem to have, there's a lot of demand for things that may not have been in demand last year. And I always say that COVID's created some arbitrary winners and losers, unfortunately, right? So,
yeah,
and hopefully that all kind of levels itself out. It does in the long run. So, it was great to speak with you, Emil. It's always great hearing what you have to say. And thanks for those who are watching, especially those who have the questions. And look forward to talking to you later this year, I'm sure. And looking forward to seeing everyone back on Friday at 2 p.m. at 1 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, John. Yep. Mark. Sorry, Mark. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Whatever. All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.